Hello, everyone. Today, I want to talk to you a little bit about Nahant Public Library and its original 1819 book collection. In 1819, a man named William Wood gave 1,000 books by his count to the town of Nahant. The town formally accepted the gift on April 15th, 1819, and the Nahant Library was founded, with the books residing in the old stone schoolhouse and loaned by the school teachers. The library was not yet tax supported nor free, but it was one of the first examples of a municipal library collection of books in Massachusetts and therefore in the country. Today, we will talk about some facts about the books and the people who gave them. "250 titles are still in extant. That's about 443 volumes, since many of them were multi-volume sets. Apparently, a few donations came in late, or perhaps Mr. Wood was still actively adding books to the collection. There was a huge variety of topics, really quite modern for its day, 1819, and many of the books obviously were older than that. And I will be talking about some of the books later on. In 1819, the books were dispensed from the schoolhouse. Teachers didn't keep good track of the books, so many of them went missing early on. An appeal to the community turned some of them up again, and in 1877, it was mentioned that there were 600 books still remaining. And if you happen to have one sitting on a shelf, please let us know. We'd love to have them back. And you'll see some examples later on, so you'll know exactly what to look for. Dan DeStefano had a list, and he tried to do an inventory at some point, noted about 10 titles were already missing from the list that he had. But thanks to Robert Wilson, the title pages and dedication pages have been photographed, and we will be uploading them to Digital Commonwealth later this year. Well, when we talk about circulating libraries in America, we're talking about the legacy of Benjamin Franklin. The idea of sharing books began informally in Philadelphia, with his friends trying to keep their own books in one place to help them settle debates and discussions. When this wasn't a good enough solution, they pooled their money to buy books that they would jointly own and could borrow. Franklin came to understand that, quote, "These libraries have improved the general conversation of Americans, made the common tradesmen and farmers as intelligent as most gentlemen from other countries, and perhaps have contributed in some degree to the stand so generally made throughout the colonies in defense of their privileges." John Adams said something similar about public education in that, quote, "The whole people must take upon themselves the education of the whole people and must be willing to bear the expenses of it." But the United States wasn't quite there yet. So what was the Boston area like around the time the 1819 collection was created? Boston's population was just under 25,000. Nahant's was probably fewer than 50. Amongst the first permanent homeowners in Nahant, there were only 3 families at that time. Christopher Gore, whose wife donated a book, was governor from 1809 to 1810. He was succeeded by Elbridge Gerry of Marblehead. Many of the facts on this list intersect with facts about the 1819 collection. Things like the yellow fever epidemic, the Louisiana Purchase, Frederick Tudor, who lived in Nahant, and the first Bishop of Boston, John Cheverus, who was a generous donor of books. Now, this is a little bit later, but it gives you an idea of the size of Midtown Boston in those days. So you can see there's quite concentrated in a small area. with another area open for Harvard and its grounds, another area around Bunker Hill, which is actually where William Wood was born, the man behind the book collection. Spanning out a little bit, it was said that Mr. William Wood was one of the first to encourage his friends to visit Nahant as a watering place, where folks could go hunting, fishing, and enjoy nature away from crowded Boston. At that time, you could stay in the homes of the few locals here, the Hoods, the Breeds, and Johnsons being the first families. Joseph Johnson, a Quaker, got himself in some hot water with his church for charging to house a stranger. And I'm going to move this so you can see William Wood right there. So you can see it was very easy. Here's Nahant in the upper right. Very easy to get on a boat and take yourself all the way across the harbor and up to Nahant. Now, Nahant is 1 square mile of land. In those days, it was only connected at low tide by a sandbar. Today, there's a sturdy causeway. So it's what's called a tombolo, an island most of the time, except when there was a sandbar. So although some people took the land route to make their way to Nahant, in those early days, it made much more sense to take a boat across, a ship. All right. Well, William Wood was born in 1777 in Charleston in the Bunker Hill area. Not born to wealth, he apprenticed in business in Boston, then served chiefly as a merchant's clerk in Liverpool when he was 20. He then went into a successful import business with his brother, moving earthenware and glassware, and then sheep even from London in 1810, and cotton from New Orleans, from New Orleans to New York and London. He was often engaged in charity work throughout his life, but providing books was his most unique hobby, and Nahant was his first known library project. After Nahant came the Mechanics Apprentices Library Association. That was about 2,000 books, which opened in Boston in February of 1820. And that was created by Wood also. His Merchant Clerks Library was also started in Boston that year. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen in New York City wrote to Wood to ask, how did he make these libraries? And he responded by going to New York and creating their library for them. He was known for talking to a businessman about his library idea, then taking books right off the businessman's shelves in front of him. He was also known for driving a wheelbarrow around town, filling it with book donations. Wood established libraries, according to one writer, quote, in prisons and poorhouses, in churches and steamboats, in merchant ships, and in the Navy. He moved to Canandaigua in 1826, living in a room in the home of his sister, Mrs. Ruth Gorham, Nathaniel Gorham's widow. He had died in 1826. Then when she died, he moved to an apartment in town he called his snuggery. In later years, he was responsible for the shade trees and plantings lining the main street of Canandaigua, and continued to help schools, prisons, and many of the projects he had already started to procure. He went on to procure more books. The mercantile libraries he created or contributed to included those in Boston, New York, Albany, Philadelphia, Liverpool, New Orleans, Louisville, Cincinnati, and Wheeling. He was known affectionately around town as Uncle Billy, and the library in Canandaigua, founded 2 years after he passed, bears his name. Was he eccentric? Absolutely. I'd like to read a little bit from a book that goes in detail about what William Wood had done to put books onto ships and into the Navy, but it also talks briefly about his unusual personality. It says, an old friend reminiscing about Wood's activities in the village wrote, he affected peculiarities in appearance, quaint ways of living, and odd means for the accomplishment of his many objects. At times, Wood, who never married, was said to disappear from his strangely furnished room in his widowed sister's home on some project of philanthropy. Later, news of his good deeds supposedly would filter back to the village and account for his absence. He never did things as other men, stated the friend. If there was any outre way of accomplishing his object, he was sure to adopt it. And he claimed his reward by his secret enjoyment of the surprise and mystification of beholders. So these are some portraits of Uncle Billy, in addition to the previous one, which is in the county courthouse in Canandaigua. On the left is a lithograph in the Ontario Historical Society collection. And it sounds by a description like it was probably the portrait given to the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen in New York City. The second one is a sketch for Wood's obituary in Balu's Pictorial Drawing Room Companion, sort of a society column. And the artist here is Winslow Homer. This is the kind of work he was doing when he was only 21. The third picture is a close-up of Nahant Library's photograph of Wood, so far the only photo I have seen. And then on the far right, a sketch from that photo attributed to the Wood Library collection, and it appears in the book I just read from, Books Afloat and Ashore. So here are the letters between William Wood and the people of Nahant. I'm going to move my icon up here so you can see the signatures. Now, Nahant was still part of the town of Lynn at that time, so there was no mayor, no board of selectmen to approach. So he approached the original families that were settled on Nahant. And in April 8th, 1819, it says, Sirs, I have collected from various quarters about 1,000 volumes of books for the purpose of forming a library at Nahant under the following conditions. These books and all others that may hereafter be given to the school and library there shall be placed under the immediate trust of yourselves, and the teacher of the school shall be empowered to hire them out to any respectable person who will deposit the value of the work at 4.50 for the small volumes and 9 per week for the larger. And the said teacher shall render a weekly account of money received, and at the expiration of each month, the amount collected shall be deposited in the savings bank in Boston to remain there until the month of April. Then the amount shall be expended in forests, trees, and shrubs annually to be planted in such parts of Nahant as the committee shall judge most proper, in order that your pleasant abode may be rendered delightful by shade. As soon as you agree to the above conditions, the books will be forwarded by your obedient servant, signed William Wood. So then a week later, on April 15th, Mr. William Wood, sir, we, the inhabitants of Nahant, have received your letter on the 8th. With books collected in Boston to form a library at this place, we jointly and severally agree and pledge ourselves to appropriate any and all monies that may be received by loaning the books to the purchasing forest trees and shrubs annually, and plant them in such situations in this place as shall be the most proper to give beauty and shade to Nahant. So just as Mr. Wood was interested in planting trees and shrubs in Canandaigua much later, so in these very early years, that was something that was of concern to him. I should say, go backwards a little bit, Nahant was bereft of trees because in colonial times, they had all been chopped down in order to make room to make Nahant the commons area for the city of Lynn. In other words, you were grazing all your flocks there. Since you could only get over at low tide by a sandbar, it was very easy to keep flocks safe from wolves by isolating them on the island. And so all the trees were mowed down to make grazing land instead, and little cropland. And it took 100 years later when people started building homes, and immediately people started coming over by boat from Boston, that they went, this is beautiful here, but there's a little bit of a problem. It's very windy, and it is still windy in Nahant today. And it's very sunny because there is no shade. So that was William Wood's project. And sure enough, his letter was notarized, and over here on the left-hand side, it says 1,075 volumes. So apparently that was the exact amount of the first collection, as far as we can tell. Here's a slightly later map from 1842, drawn by Alonzo Lewis. And you can see Nahant's main street running across the middle from west to east. And along that road and many of the side streets, you can see little dots along the side. And the little dots represent the trees that were being replanted. Now, at first, apparently, William Wood himself and Thomas Perkins Jr., there's an account where they were planting the trees themselves by hand, but eventually, a gentleman named Frederick Tudor, nicknamed the Ice King because he had come up with a way to ship ice overseas. He took over the project. He had people for that. And he owned all this property pretty much in the middle band here. And you can see in this map, there were all these trees that were planted, and there were also fruit trees, groves of fruit trees, and there were other places where there were shrubs planted in Nahant. So eventually, today, if you walk around Nahant, it looks like quite an arboretum because people had a variety of trees planted all over. So here's a later picture of the Mercantile Library in Boston and a list of many of his book projects and when they took place. We know that Liverpool was in 1823, although he may have started something before then. Brooklyn also in 1823. Some of these may have been more by correspondence. Perhaps New Orleans was more of that, even though he was in New Orleans at one point. A lot of the work may have been done just by his instructions remotely, but we know that many of them were ones in which he went in person and just got to work. You often don't see his name show up in as a founder of these libraries because he wasn't much of a joiner. He didn't like to get on boards and committees. He just liked to go to work. And in fact, in some cases, they invited him to come back for anniversaries and so on. They wanted his portrait. And he tended to just decline. He liked to be the guy behind the scenes. Now, what was his motivation in all of this? Here it is in his own words from William Wood's diary, March 31st, 1841. He says, "This day brings me to my 65th." Yes, it was his 64th birthday, so the beginning of his 65th year, being born in 1777. The past 12 months have glided away very pleasantly, and I hope with utility, it having been my object to confer a benefit on anyone daily who needed. Since October, my time has been divided within my snuggery between retirement, reading, and rheumatism, etc. among any first pleasures is the extension of the Merchant Clerks Library in Baltimore and Montreal, Canada. Both have made me an honorary member. In short, the object of my year was to do some good to all. Oh, and I do want to thank the Ontario County Library for that piece from his diary. Now I'd like to turn to the books themselves. Typical to the period, many books were transcriptions of sermons, exegetical discourse, or other religious materials. Both Protestant, Catholic religions were represented, as is Unitarianism. Book number 66 is a travel book given by Mrs. Walter Channing, whose brother-in-law was the Unitarian preacher William Ellery Channing, and whose son was the Transcendentalist William Ellery Channing Jr. Another Unitarian donor was Reverend William Bentley of Salem. His house is now owned in Salem by the Peabody Essex Museum. And two books that we know of donated by Boston Unitarian pastor Reverend Francis Parkman. Government donors included Daniel Webster, attorney before the Supreme Court, and he was a U.S. Senator as well. Timothy Bigelow, Mass Speaker of the House in 1820. Mrs. Samuel Dexter, widow of a U.S. representative. Mrs. James T. Austin, born Catherine Gary, wife of a Mass Attorney General and the daughter of Elbridge Gary. And Harrison Gray Otis, U.S. Senator and Mayor of Boston. Many donors were Harvard graduates and attorneys. In the case of the New York Mercantile Library, the board initially only wanted nonfiction materials, but the apprentices actually protested and got them to change their minds. The Nahant Library collection has no such restrictions, however, and it then included in its oldest book, pictured here, the 1632 Latin Vulgate Bible gifted by John Chevers, first Bishop of Boston. And he was an important person in those days. He was sent to take care of the Irish that were coming over, and it was very, people were kind of prejudiced against Catholics at that time. He did a great work to help ease people's minds about Catholicism. There were plays, classics like the Iliad. Most interesting, perhaps, was one called The Spanish Friar, once banned by the British king in the 1600s, which takes aim at all forms of government and religious corruption. Then there were novels by Walter Scott, who wrote Ivanhoe in 1819. We have two recent novels and two works of poetry, recent for that day at least. There was the comic and sometimes naughty novel, The Expedition of Humphrey Clinker. There were the works of Jonathan Swift of Gulliver's Travels fame. There was Caleb's In Search of a Wife, a popular novel in 1809 about finding a wife who would live up to his late mother's expectations. Now it's been described as one of the most unreadable books in history. And The Saracen, a popular novel of its time in which a future nun and a Muslim man fall in love during the First Crusade. There was a children's book called The Ward of Delamere by Elizabeth Pinchard, who wrote novels for older children to give them moral guidance. And there were reference works, travelogues, encyclopedias, and bound periodicals. I would add that there were a few books in which the pages had not been cut apart, which you might do with some, they might be sent bound with the pages not separated yet. And so we know that some of those books had never been read in their entirety. So there were maps in some of these books too. Very interesting at that point in the 1700s. Some of these books and maps date to what people thought America looked like at that point. And I don't believe Nahant shows up in any of them. a French Atlas Moderne Portatif. It's a picture of New England, and it looks like Cape Cod is just about to punch out the mainland there. Another picture from the Atlas Moderne. You can also see how important it would be to have an accurate rendering of the maps, because here's what was to be the Louisiana Purchase. Now, this book was in 1786, and the purchase was made in 1803. So you can imagine that wars can be fought over not knowing exactly where the boundaries are. Take a look at Florida down there, looks a little unusual, and the Great Lakes look a little unusual as well. And what in the world is going on over here? It's also interesting, some of the extra artwork that gets thrown in. You get some pictures of what somebody thought Native Americans looked like at that time. And another one is the general history of the late war. The late war here was the 7 Years' War, which included the French and Indian War in America. And again, down here, a picture of Native Americans. In this one, it looks like they have shirts on. There's a line at the neckline. Illustrations help put across moral lessons with more impact. Here's Jesus rebuking Satan and welcoming the angels. So it's sort of a picture of beat it, Satan. I have these pretty angels coming my way. You know, this was after the days in the wilderness and temptation. And if you don't think that's how school children in the 1800s thought about these kinds of things, well, here's a biblical story where Joash's mother tries to protect him. But if you look really close, here someone stuck a pipe in Athaliah's mouth. It's drawn in pencil. These books were made available almost from the beginning, I believe, to school children. And we did notice that in at least one case, a book had made its way to the school in later years and was returned back to the library. So yes, a lot of these books have scribbles in them, people trying to practice their penmanship or just drawings in general. So illustrations like this help people in America understand Europe, which was the center of culture at that time. For example, this is an illustration of Shakespeare's statue, and on the right, a photograph of what it looks like. The drawings were how people learned about the treasures of the world if they couldn't travel to see them. Here's a French book of fables from 1768. The drawings look as if no one had ever seen these animals. This one is a picture of a bear. This one's an eagle. This one is a fox and a hedgehog and some flies. And these are monkeys. The author that appeared probably the most was Sir Walter Scott. He also seemed to have been a favorite of William Wood. Wood was known to hand out a hair from Scott's head to his friends. Now, in those days, it wasn't that unusual to have a lock of hair from somebody famous and perhaps gift it to somebody. But in this case, he wanted to dole them out very carefully, so he would only give one hair to a friend, a special friend or visitor. And nobody knows for sure if that hair was real. Some of his detractors said it was strands from the tail of a white horse. And if you think that's a little far-fetched, he owned a white horse. Many of the donors' books traveled in the same circle as William Wood. Some were considered Boston Brahmins for being early Puritan descendants, WASPs, and wealthy, often Harvard graduates. So some of those, there were 15 Brahmin names that we discovered in the dedications to books. They included Adams, Amory, Appleton, Bradley, Codman, Coolidge, Otis, Parkman, Perkins, Phillips, Rice, Sargent, Sears, William Smith Shaw that you see here, and Tudor. William Smith Shaw was the first librarian of Boston Athenaeum from 1807 to 1822, and he died in 1826. He donated a small encyclopedia. The Harvard librarian also donated the books. It's interesting, the dedication from him looked like it was going to say Harvard president. President was scratched out and librarian written instead. And then William Smith Shaw and his encyclopedia. Another one was just written in a Brookfield farmer, and it was a book about raising sheep. Another one was a Maine farmer, a statistical view of the District of Maine. Now that was donated in 1819. Maine split off as a district of Massachusetts the following year, 1820. Eli Sawtelle, interesting. A couple of donors are notable in that they probably were not part of the Brahmin circle, but Wood took their donations all the same. Donor Eli Newton Sawtelle, who donated a travelogue on New England, was a farm boy turned congregational minister who traveled all over New England and the then West, which was Ohio, and later founding the Cleveland Female Seminary, a boarding school for girls and precursor of a women's college in 1854. A broadside from 1826 says, the Reverend Mr. Sawtelle from East Tennessee is now visiting Boston. He was studying at Andover Seminary that year. As an agent in behalf of the literary and theological seminary in that state, and the object of Mr. Sawtelle is to obtain donations in money and books for the increase of its library. So William Wood's legacy carried on in other people who picked up the idea of getting donations of books to expand libraries. So one of the donations is from Abner Hood. That's important in that he was one of the original families to settle. So I was wondering if the original families themselves had donated books. And we have this one example of a book from Abner Hood. This is another one. This is from Thomas Perkins Jr., Thomas Handesid Perkins, the son of the gentleman who was a huge donor in the Boston area, had created the School for the Blind, the Perkins School. And an important little piece here is you can see in these pictures a little stamp. The embossed stamp there is from 1872, which is when the library turned to being a free public library. And so it's an indication that they were still using some of these, at least some of the 1819 book collection as late as 1872. Here is Frederick Tudor, the Ice King, with two of his books. Again, the stamp appears, and Tudor, always the businessman, had actually written in how much the books cost. This one, $2.75. This one, $2. This one, the dedication written in Samuel Appleton's hand. Appleton was a Boston merchant and an artist. The library owns two of his works, and he was a patron of the well-known artist Frederick Church. This one is the Book of Common Prayer, the largest book by size in the collection. It was given by the wife of the governor. Beautiful, and gold leaf dedication there, but still in William Wood's hand is his written in dedication of the book. This one by Timothy Bigelow, Mass Speaker of the House. Note that there's a sticker on here that says the book was found in grammar school 1888. Another book has an autograph of a Franklin Dexter Esquire, probably the future Massachusetts rep and later senator. So his own, on the title page, you can see written in, probably in Bigelow's own hand, 1790, perhaps when he had acquired the book, and then later presented to Nahant Library in 1820, 1 year after the original books were presented. Here's Walter Channing, doctor and Harvard professor of obstetrics. He later became a co-founder of a hospital for women that became Brigham and Williams Hospital, very famous in Boston. He was one of the first to use ether as an anesthetic in childbirth. He was a brother to the Unitarian preacher William and Ellery Channing, and father of transcendentalist poet William Ellery Channing Jr. So that's his autograph in the book. Here's the Eli Newton Sawtelle, as I mentioned. All you see over on the left is his autograph. You can also see how damaged some of these books are. They've at one point there was a leak sometime before my time, but there was a leak in the roof of the room that stores them, and ruined some of the dedications actually. This one, a gift by a Brookfield farmer to the Nahant School and Library. Some of them were dedicated to the school, some to the library. So it was obviously known that these were going to be stored at the school. And this one, straight up from a Maine farmer, about the District of Maine. And somebody had drawn in a map by hand in the front matter there. And so we looked it up. It's the Kenduskeag brook running through there, and Hammond Street. So we know that it's actually downtown Bangor, Maine. So what can we learn from all of this? The prospect of providing books to the village of Nahant was embraced by many, sparked by the vision of one man. The known collection represents a broad range of topics, even though it would be pure speculation to try and make some statistical observations, since we only have part of collection. And indeed, the part that we have might be the ones that other people didn't want. And so that's why we still have them, and they didn't walk away with people who failed to return them. But we do see in the collection that remains a very broad range of topics. So it gives us an idea that this was a fairly forward-thinking collection of books. No bias involved. Nahant embraced the idea of having books long before it was equipped to properly house, organize, and develop a library collection. This was a very early incident of people wanting books, and wanting reading and understanding the importance of reading to being educated and getting ahead. Wood went on to do this specifically for apprentices and merchants, so that he would keep them out of the pool halls, as he said, and give them a leg up, just as he had gotten a leg up by being self-taught, self-educated. William Wood's legacy lives on in the Nahant Public Library and the later National Library movement. Libraries today, public libraries all over the US, are the people's university, and they will be as long as we choose to support them. Thank you very much. There are so many people I would like to thank, and so here's a list.